Climb into the cockpit with pilot and Link Square's Chief Legal Officer, Tim Perilla, as he invites legal leaders aboard to share advice that will help you navigate even the most turbulent times of in-house counsel work. We'll cover a range of topics from data privacy to legal team structure to public company transactions and beyond. You don't want to miss this series. Fasten your seatbelt and prepare for takeoff. You're listening to Cockpit Counsel.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Cockpit Counsel. My name is Tim. I'm the Chief Legal Officer at Link Squares. With us, as always, is our producer, Alyssa Verzino. And today, really excited, we have Mannat Sharma with us. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
So we start off every show exactly the same. We ask, what is your pre-flight ritual?
Okay, so I've been flying a lot recently, so I have this down to a science, I think. There's like 4 steps. So the first is some kind of workout / getting my steps in, like just because you're going to be sitting. And then a lot of hydration. I will get like multiple water bottles, overpriced, of course, at the airport, but necessary. And then I guess it's only 3. I try to think of one thing before the flight that I not want to accomplish on the flight, but what is this flight going to be? So some flights are just relax, chill, watch a movie, read. Some flights are for work and some flights you sleep. So I try to give myself like, okay, this is going to be one of those flights. And then that way I don't have to worry about like what I'm doing during that time. So
nice. That's awesome. So let's get right into it. Let's talk a little bit about your career path. What are you doing now? How'd you get there?
Yeah. So I am currently product counsel at a big tech company based in New York City. The company itself is based out on the West Coast, but I'm in the New York City office. And product counsel is really advising new product development and counseling teams as they build new products. So it's a really hands-on kind of working with the business type of legal role, which I really love. I've been doing that for 2 years. And prior to that, I was a tech and IP transactions associate at a big law firm also based in New York. And that was really supporting large M&A deals, some standalone deals, but really focusing on tech and IP. So that's been my career so far. And I started, graduated from NYU Law and have been doing it so far. So it's been great.
That's awesome. How many people are on your legal team?
So that's a tricky question because the actual legal team of the company is like thousands, but the team that I'm on is, I would say, around like 15 to 20 people who are supporting not just my products, but supporting the larger platform that I support. So everyone's got a bit of a different function, but I'm lucky to work with a lot of great people.
That's fun. So like day in and day out, you're working with about 20 or so people, 20 or so attorneys, right?
Yeah. So it's funny because of the role of product counsel, I'm working a lot more with business folks. So
Sure.
That's like the most of the time. And then when it comes to legal, I would say, yeah, it's a spread of about 15 people across all different functionalities. Yeah.
Very cool. That's a lot of fun. So as far as your career path, what made you want to transition to an in-house role?
Yeah. So one through line in my career so far has been sort of based in technology and, starting in tech and IP and then now at a big tech company. So I knew I wanted to stay sort of in that arena. About my 3rd or 4th year in big law, I started to think a little bit about what's my next step. Is it staying at the firm? Is it trying to make partner? Is it trying something else? And I've always sort of had this itch of something entrepreneurial, something a little bit out of the box. And so I was basically cold calling and emailing people across the industry from different firms, different companies, like people who had done entrepreneurial ventures and just trying to understand their career paths. And I came across the role of product counsel, and it was kind of a perfect role in my mind because it sort of had a mixture of technology, business, and law. And that was exactly the skill set that I wanted to dive into more. And so by around that time, I just, started to realize, okay, this might be the right next step. And eventually it might open up some other doors. And I was able to make some great connections through these sort of cold calls and networking. And one of the connections reached out to me and said, there's this role on this team that's amazing. If you want to try, go for it. And then I ended up getting that role. So it was a bit of like a progress. It didn't happen right away, but I think it's like one of those things that once you feel like you have an itch to try something new, and you find something that's a good fit, it's like, the green light to do so.
Yeah, especially if you're working big law hours and you're on you're on that partner path, you're in that practice area, the work oftentimes can become seemingly repetitive.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. I think at some point in any organization, regardless of big law or what your industry is, you sort of realize, like, am I plateauing? Am I still learning? Is this where I want to be? And I think I felt like I wanted to get a new skill set. And that's why that product counsel pivot is really a pivot in terms of skill set from an M&A background. So that was kind of part of the analysis, was to get a new set of skills.
The product counsel role is really interesting. That was so prior to joining Link Squares, and actually even at Link Squares in a little bit of a different way. A lot of my time was, so I was at DraftKings prior to Link Squares, and a lot of my time was spent, especially early on, like as the first lawyer there, especially early on when we were developing new games and trying to innovate in the paid fantasy sports space. The product counsel work was just so much fun. Oh. It was so awesome. And like, it makes you feel, at first, it makes you feel like you could be a really good product person until you learn enough about it and recognize that you would be a terrible product person.
Yes.
Because it's kind of like, to a certain extent, like a lot of people view products in a way that's similar to marketing, where it's like you have access to product all the time and you're interacting with product all of the time. You're interacting with marketing materials all of the time. That doesn't make you a good marketer because you watch a lot of television commercials, right? Or you read a lot of cold emails or whatever, right? Social media posts, which we'll get to in a second. But like, I love that product counsel stuff because it really does give you an appreciation for the amount of talent that those people really have and how specialized the great ones really are.
Yeah, I totally agree. There's it's a real skill set. Like, I had a similar thought, like, oh, maybe it'd be fun to jump over to their side, and I realized it's a whole path, and there's a lot to learn there. So yeah, I'm like happy to be in the product counsel lane and sort of stay there.
So let's talk about TikTok. You've got a huge presence on TikTok. How'd you get into that?
So it's interesting. Once I'd moved over to the in-house side of things, as you'd mentioned, there's definitely a shift that I felt in terms of work-life balance. I had a lot more time on my hands compared to when I was in Big Law, and that I just had like even just nights and weekends. And so I really was with this newfound work-life balance, and I was able to kind of like build my life in a more fulfilling way. And one of the things I felt I was missing at the time was a creative outlet. Like, I realized I had a good workout routine. I had, friends, I'd covered all these bases, but I didn't really have a creative outlet. So one day I decided, like, everyone's on this TikTok thing, let me try. And like, I made a few videos, nothing with my face in it, because I never intended to. I never thought that it was never on my radar. And then the one day I just was looking through some old photos, and I came across the photos from my first year, and I just kind of saw a flashback of myself then. And, I had a pretty intense Big Law experience, and that I
Sure.
did it all. I was just saying yes to everything, and like, don't regret it for a second. I really like went for it, but that means I was really exhausted all the time. So I'm looking through these pictures, like, I don't even recognize who this is anymore. Like, I'm completely different now, 4 years later, and my life is so different. And I just kind of had a moment of reflection, and I made a video about it, just talking about my journey and how I had this dream in my mind. I didn't grow up in the US, and like sort of this idea of being a New York lawyer got there, and decided to change my mind. And that was such a big deal for me to change my mind. I think a lot of people feel that way when they're making a career pivot, like especially lawyers, that it's so scary and there's a lot of calculation to it. So I, long story short, made that video, and it just went viral. And I had a moment of reflection after it did go viral, that do I, one, delete this and pretend it never happened and just go back to like, oh, this is not something that I do. I'm a lawyer. I don't do this. Or do I see this as an interesting opportunity? And also, it seems like there's a community here of people that, have had similar experience to me. And so I decided to choose the latter route and have been, making and building this community for a little over a year now. And it's been a really, really cool experience.
That's awesome. What have been a few of the things that have been most surprising to you about that? Whether it's on the personal reflection and how your views on it have changed over that time, or whether it's the community. Would love to just hear some of the surprises or things that you now know, like talking to somebody who maybe is like, oh, I'd love to do more on social media or whatever. Like,
Yeah.
what to expect that you never would have thought.
Yeah. Two things really come to mind. The first is just on a personal level is how much I've learned about myself through this experience. But biggest thing is like, if you're someone who does think a lot about what people think of you, you're a bit of a people pleaser like I am, and I think more on the type A side, the idea of putting myself out there and making content and publishing my ideas in a public forum is just not something that would come naturally to me. And so the exercise of, feeling comfortable with what you're putting out there and then not really caring what people think in terms of judgment. Obviously some, constructive criticism is always welcomed, but I think just like getting over that hurdle and realizing, yeah, my peers will see some of these videos, like, and it's kind of a cool experience because what ends up happening is most people are like, this is awesome, and like are so, inspired. And I have friends now who are lawyers and some are ex-lawyers who are starting their own content, creation like projects, which I love. And so I think just there's an exercise in just like learning how to put yourself out there in a way that you don't normally do in your day-to-day job as a lawyer. And then also just the fact that I have a creative bone. I thought I didn't. I think as a lawyer, you're so type A and very analytical in your day-to-day. I would have never thought that I was like creative at all. And now I think I would consider myself to be a creative person. And then the second thing is people talk a lot about building an online community. And I never really understood like what that means. And now that I see that it really does feel like a community, especially as you're growing something, you're just getting the feedback from the people who are interested in what you're saying. There's this really great like back and forth. And I think that's the great side of social media. I know there's obviously a lot of discussion to be had about social media in our society, but there is something really cool about being able to build a community of people who share similar interests and who are, there's conversations in the comments and, things people are like making connections. And I think that is just something I didn't expect from that one video. So
that's pretty wild. Yeah, I think the conversational aspect that you can get, I think particularly when you are coming at it from a professional sort of bend, right? When your community is other lawyers, tell me if you feel differently, but you almost feel as though there's a little bit of a safety net built in. Like, I'm sure you probably had people just absolutely slam you in comments, and it's probably not fun. But at the same time, like anybody who's doing that, you've got to be looking at it. Like everybody else who sees that is like, all right, like that's not what this is about, and that person's really not a true pro.
Yeah.
Right. It's almost discrediting to go that route, as opposed to like, politics or something where everyone slams everybody and
yeah. Yeah.
So.
Although they'll say it's funny that with the internet, like you're going to offend somebody or you're going to strike a bone with someone no matter what you say. It's really funny. You can sort of like say like, I like bananas, and someone will be like, bananas have this, terrible thing associated, and so you kind of, there's no end to that. So I think to your point, like when you have a community of lawyers like mine or people who are just interested in like bettering themselves, like they're just positive and they're like, okay, banana person, it's fine. Like we don't need to worry about it. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. So what are some of the biggest differences that you've found personally working in-house now versus what you were dealing with at the firm?
I think there's a few things. The first is just that because you're part of the business, regardless of your role in-house, whether you're like, product counsel really sitting with the business, or your contracts counsel, or like you are part of the business now. And so there is a mentality shift that happens where it's in your best interest to get buy-in from your business counterparts, and you have this shared goal that you're working towards. And so I think that changes the framing of a lot of the guidance that you'll give. And it sometimes even changes the risk tolerance that that you think about. And so that's a huge piece. I think with outside counsel, you're really trying to give like the gold standard, the best advice you can give. And you're not in the day-to-day nitty-gritty of the business. So you sometimes don't have that view with your advice. And so that's one big thing. And I think the other thing is I found that your ability to ingest large amounts of information, often complex, into something that's like really easy to digest for your business counterparts is like key, because they're no longer interested in reading a memo or a huge email or like this. That's not like your work product anymore. It's like, hey, Mannat, like is this okay to do like at 5 p.m. on a Friday? And it's kind of like a little more than yes or no, but you want to give something that's like clear, actionable, and is going to solve their problem. And so, if the firm got that, it would be like, okay, well, here's the analysis and here's the options, and, which makes sense. That's like why you want the firm. But I think as in-house counsel, you're really there to be like, okay, I know the risks here with this product, and I'm giving you the short and sweet, easy to understand answer.
Yeah, absolutely. And we talk a lot on the show about perspectives and what your role and responsibility is to the business and with the business as an in-house attorney versus a firm attorney.
Yeah.
And, it really is your expertise in understanding the business that people value when you're in-house. Like if you come in and do the same thing that you were doing as an outside law firm and saying like, oh, well, this is kind of what the law says, figure it out. Like you're not going to be very successful, right? You have to have a view, and you've got to commit, and you've got to be a part of the team.
Yeah, absolutely. I had to learn that actually the hard way, where the first few months I like created work for myself and like would work on weekends for no reason and produce these documents, and had to learn like that's not what the client's asking. That's not what your job is. So it is a little bit of a learning curve, but yeah, you're exactly right.
Remember early on in my career, it was like in the first, so I've been fortunate enough to be in-house my entire career. I was reporting into CFO, and one of the first couple of months I had brought something to him. He asked me to chase something down. I said, all right, well, you could do this, or you could do this, or you could do this. And he was like, don't do that. He's like, tell me what to do. Like, you're here because I want you to tell me what to do and why. Don't make me just figure it all out, because I don't like, even though you tell me this, that, and the next thing, and all these like, parade of horribles or hypotheticals. He's like, I asked you because I want to know what you think, right? Not how you think about it, right?
Right.
And
right.
Being early in your career, especially someone who didn't have law firm experience, had never worked for another lawyer with the exception of the couple of years. I worked for a publishing company when I was in law school and worked closely with their general counsel and AGC. And like, that was it. Like, it's kind of daunting from like I would never think that the CFO of a company at 27 years old, 26 years old, however old I was at the time, would actually want to know what I think about something that has to do with their business. And it was a really intimidating thing. Like, okay, later on, you realize like, all right, he kind of already knew what he was going to do. And like, it was a development exercise. And we ended up talking through, well, why do you think that way? Like, let's talk about it now in the context of the business. And there was a lot of development that happened, throughout my time there, working with that person that helped me to recognize you've got to be confident, you've got to take a position, and you're going to be wrong a lot. And that's okay.
Exactly. Yeah, I totally agree. That is your value add. It's like you have an intimate knowledge of the business, of the product, and like also the law. So that's kind of putting those things together, like being someone who's able to give a solution is like very key. Yeah.
Exactly. So what do you think, as far as skills or experience, what do you think is most important to develop to be successful in-house?
The most important thing, honestly, I think is being able to collaborate well with your clients who are your business counterparts. And I use that word because I think it's a mixture of the communication. It's a mixture of building rapport, and your clients have to be able to trust you. So when they come to you for advice, like they need to know that you understand what you're saying. You kind of like understand their business, and that's like, I think, so critical in house, is being able to explain to the team sometimes the difficult no's, like, and like what could be an alternative path. It's not always, they're not coming to you with like the easy cookie cutter option. So I think that collaboration, that collaborative mindset is very key. And then again, just remembering that you are on the same team. And so, sometimes taking off the lawyer hat that might want you to just say like, no, here are all the risks and this is why we can't do this. And kind of being like, okay, how can I work with you to find something that makes sense for you, and that, your clients also feel like they have buy-in and they have a stake in as well.
That's been my experience as well. I think making those relationships is absolutely critical. Like strengthening those is really, really important. You have a massive immediate sort of legal organization around you. How are you leveraging your colleagues for challenging conversations with the business?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think there's a few things. Like the first is really just when you start in a new company, understanding what people do and what their role is. Like a lot of it is, what's their scope, and when do I need to be engaging this person? Then it's like, how does your co-counsel want to be engaged? Some people have like, they're just the nature of their work is one where you can't just ask them a quick question. It's got to be kind of set out. So I try to keep that in mind. And then depending on how your organization is set up, I think it is really helpful for if you are going to your co-counsel for a question that is ultimately your client's question, you're sort of the liaison between them. You're the person that's like talking to your co-counsel and like coming together as a kind of combined legal voice, rather than sometimes like, I've seen like, okay, client, let me connect you with this other person. And that sort of like, I think just doesn't streamline the process. So really being like a partner to your co-counsel and being able to, understand like what's their scope, how do I want to engage them, how do they want to be engaged, and like how can I facilitate this so that they also come to you when they have a question on your scope, and you kind of have that partnership. And I think it is uniquely sort of an in-house thing, because when you're at a firm, usually it's very siloed, your roles, and like you kind of know very clearly. Whereas in-house, like there is a little bit more of that overlap sometimes, and some difference between how people want to be engaged. So I think just like keeping that in mind, and helping to facilitate the conversation with your client.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a ton of sense. And how do you manage escalations? Like what I mean by that is how do you know when it's your call to make from a legal perspective, and when you got to run it up the chain?
That's a great question, especially as someone who's still relatively early in the career. So I think there's a little bit of like the legal risk analysis that you have to make in terms of like, what's the urgency of this ask? Is this something that there's like a time sensitivity to it, or there's a business risk associated with it? Those things, I think some of those like internal flags, I would just escalate sooner, like early and often kind of rule, because the last thing you want to do is then, push on the business's timeline. Because I have seen that happen, / I have made that mistake before, where I think I'll just handle it. It'll be fine. And then, they do have a timeline at the end of the week, and now it's Thursday and I have one day to escalate this, and you don't want to be in that position. So what I like to do is, like, when I think it's something where there's some sense of urgency, whether it's time, business pressure, or something else, I'll just like notify the next person that I should escalate, like, hey, this is something that might come down, and just let them have that kind of communication ahead of time. And if they want to be engaged and for it to be escalated right away, like, we can do that. But I think just having that communication, and obviously every business organization is different, but for me, it's directly to my manager. And so I just will sometimes flag, like, hey, this is something that I think might require your attention. But, if you want, here's the TLDR, if you want something bigger than that. But I do think when it comes to escalations, especially early in your career, err on the side of caution is sort of the lesson that I've learned.
Earlier and more frequently.
Just in case you don't want to be the person who's stopping, a launch. So,
so let's talk a little bit about tips for folks who are still at the firm, looking to go in-house. How do you think about the search? How do you think about positioning yourself? You obviously showed a ton of ambition, a ton of drive, cold calling, networking, et cetera, to get yourself into an outstanding role. What are some other maybe concrete takeaways that you could give to people?
Yeah. So I think when we think about going from, private practice to in-house is a huge, huge like arena. There's so many different roles that you can take. And I think that's something I didn't appreciate when I wasn't on the side. And I think that one of the things that can be really helpful is to do a little bit of an investigation of, like, what are the roles that are out there? Because sometimes there isn't a direct one-to-one between your role at a private practice and your role in-house. Like, mine was certainly not a direct one-to-one. I don't do tech and IP M&A in-house. And so I think just like understanding the landscape of what are the different roles, and you could do that by simply, like, honestly searching on LinkedIn jobs or searching of the, organizations that you're interested in, seeing their career sites and just seeing what are the roles, reading the job descriptions, just getting like some research as to what's out there. And then once you have that, I think trying to understand your own strengths and interests. There's like sort of an analysis that I did and that I like suggest to my mentees that I mentor is, like, write a list of your strengths, write a list of your interests, and try to see if you can find in your next role something that complements the combination of those things. And so when you're looking for that next thing, like trying to get a good fit. And once you have an idea of what you're interested in, then I do think the best way is to try to leverage your network. And you don't have to cold email and do that route if you don't need to. I simply didn't have that many connections at the time that I was looking. But I think just looking through your network and being able to reach out to folks, because this industry is really all about your networks and your connections and your relationships. And a lot of the roles that you might be really interested in have referral programs and have like ways for, in-house employees to say, hey, this person, reached out to me and they seem interesting. Let's put their resume to the top. So that's I think one thing. And then also, like, separate from that is trying to get engaged in person with like bar associations, with like organizations in the legal community, because you do get great visibility into the rules that are available. Like, there's a lot of newsletters and affinity groups, and there's just so many places that you can kind of build a community if you don't have one yet. And whether it's going to an event or like just reading through a newsletter, I think just staying engaged in that way can be really helpful too.
Yeah, and it seems like it's important to actually make an effort to not just join a community, like to be active in it, sounds like.
Yeah, I think so, because you're that's where you're going to get the benefit of the relationships. You're going to learn something, and you might be like I kind of was surprised at the role that I was going to be interested in. And so you never know what doors could open up that way. So I think especially in we're on Zoom today, but in a post-pandemic world, getting in person, I think, is like really helpful. So if you can go and be at some of those events and be involved, it's like a really great way to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's awesome. And you've touched on work-life balance a bit. I'd love to hear more about how you approach being effective at work, but then also having balance in your life overall.
Yeah. So there's a few things. I think one thing is recognize, are you in like the 80% of your life or the 20%? And what I mean by that is like, well, hopefully that's the split. Maybe sometimes it might be a little different, but 80% of your days are not like everything's urgent, everything's on fire, you're slammed, you're just so busy. Hopefully like 80% of your days are, busy, but they're manageable. And so if you're in that part of your life, that's where I think trying to build out practices in outside of work that kind of give you some cushion for when the 20% comes, where it is just like all fires, really busy, and you just kind of are in a stretch. And I think labeling it as such is really helpful. And so like the Q4 is kind of a great example that we're in right now. Like it is going to be really busy no matter where you are. So kind of reminding yourself like we're just in that 20%. But when you have 80% of the days where you are implementing tools in your own life, I think that really helps. And one of the things that I do that I talk about online as well is a framework that I built called Mind, Body, Craft. And that is really a framework that tries to give you like tools to implement goals for your mind, everything internal to you, your body, your physical body, and then your craft, which can include your job, but also other passions and interests and things that make you feel alive. And so it's really simple because you can just do one of those things each day. And the more you do it, the more you feel like, oh, I've done something for myself today. And I've done something for my body. I've done something for my craft. And it sort of like helps you build out a life where otherwise you might just remain that 20%. So that's something that I try to keep in mind. And it is tricky. I mean, having balance is something I think we're all striving for. So
Definitely. Yeah. And also when you're speaking about frameworks, I'm curious, do you have any frameworks when it comes to making a life decision or even a career decision, transitions like that? Anything else that you think about in that way?
yeah, I mean, I mentioned a little bit about the strengths and interests. I think that's like a way to kind of figure out where you're coming from and what you might be interested in. But one of the other things that's really helpful is I mentioned, I think sometimes we overanalyze our choice. We think our choice is actually riskier than it is. When I was leaving the firm to go in-house, I thought I was making the biggest decision of my life that would, be the end all. And the reality is like, it's, you'll change your career often, and it just feels like it's such a big decision at the time. So I think sometimes taking a step back and doing a little bit of a risk allocation of really like worst case scenario, what would happen if this job didn't turn out to be what I thought it was going to be? Am I still, here are the benefits of this job. Here are the things that are going to protect from any downside risk. And then just kind of reminding yourself like, okay, this calculus is actually not as risky or as intensive a change as I thought. And that kind of helps you, I think, come to a clearer decision about, what is the right path forward.
That's amazing. Yeah, you have such good frameworks to help people with mindset. Do you have I'm just like thinking now, but do you have anything for productivity? Like those times like you were talking about when you're in the 20% and you have so much on your plate, and yes, you've labeled it, but do you have any other productivity tips for listeners?
I do, Alyssa. I have a bunch my toolkit. I'll give a couple. So I mean, these are pretty simple and they're really out there, but these are some of the things that I really implement in my life. One is time blocking. So in your calendar, blocking out chunks of time and separating your day into like, I do 3 hours, so 3-hour chunks, and trying to like figure out one task that you can do in that chunk and kind of getting it done. There's a stat that like we get 20% less. I'm going to butcher it, but basically multitasking is not good. Single tasking is the way to go. So trying to just, focus on one single task in that block. The other thing that could be helpful if you're getting fatigued is to change your environment and kind of move from, even if it's like one desk to another, and like when you change your environment, also cycle your tasks. So change to a new task that can trigger your brain to like, we're doing something else, we're starting something new. I also use the 20-80 rule, which is 20% of the things produce 80% of the impact. So when you have a lot going on, 20% of the decisions, 20% of the tasks are actually going to produce 80% of the impact. So what is the 20% that you can focus on that is going to give you the 80%? So especially when you have those days where you're not even sure where to start. And the last thing is I'll say is I also really I really like when you have a task that's constant throughout the day, sort of batching it. So a great example of this is for emails. Instead of constantly answering emails or pings or messages throughout the day, which will derail you from your tasks, if you can just set out like 15 minutes, in the morning, in the afternoon, and before you sign off of like, this is email answering time, aside from obviously urgent ones, that can kind of help simplify your day when it does just seem like there's everything at all times. Those are a few that I can rattle off. Yeah.
That's awesome.
All right. Well, we end every episode with some rapid fire questions. Okay. So the first one is, what is your hot take on working in-house?
You're not always just being a lawyer. Sometimes you're the business person. Sometimes you're product as well. You're not always wearing the lawyer hat.
Love it. What is your number one tip for personal branding?
Remember what makes you unique and is your value add.
Love it. Tips for establishing a network as a new in-house legal professional.
Really get out there and join events, be engaged in your community.
Awesome. And then what's one strategy for maintaining boundaries between work and personal life?
Communicate with your team about what your boundaries are and then stick to them.
Awesome. Thank you.
So I like to jump in with one final question at the end. First, thank you for joining us. This has been an awesome conversation. But before we go, what's a charity or a cause that you're really passionate about that you'd like us to try to amplify, get the word out there so that our listeners can help contribute?
Absolutely. I love that question. So there's a charity in New York called the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And they do some great work around cruelty prevention for animals, animal shelters, policy work. And they're just a cause that I've been donating to for quite a while. And I've grown up with animals. So animal welfare is really close to my heart. So that's one that I would recommend.
That's awesome. Well, Mannat, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. This is a great conversation. And we're going to have to do this again in person. Maybe Alyssa and I come down to New York, or if you happen to find reason to be up in Boston, we'd love to host you here. It would be really great. So thank you so much.
I'd love that. Thank you both so much. This is great.
Thanks. And if you like the episode, give us a like, follow, subscribe on all the socials, and we will see you next time. Thanks.